The fastest way to reveal a person's character isn't to hand them power, it's to let them believe they're looking down on someone who has none. The first time I stepped through the iron gates of the Moretti estate, I reminded myself to breathe normally, even though nothing about the place felt normal. The mansion overlooked the Hudson like it had been standing there long before the city learned how to dream in glass and steel. Every stone reflected quiet wealth instead of loud luxury, and every staff member moved with practiced precision that made my black waitress uniform feel strangely ordinary. Vincent had insisted dinner would be simple. Just my mother, he'd said that afternoon with a calm smile that somehow made me more nervous instead of less. Vincent rarely exaggerated anything. If he sounded cautious, there was always a reason. A housekeeper opened the massive front door before I even reached the steps. "Miss Emma, welcome." Her warm smile settled my nerves for exactly 3 seconds. Then I heard elegant footsteps crossing polished marble. Vincent appeared at the end of the entrance hall wearing the same perfectly tailored black suit he always seemed born to wear. The black tattoos climbing over his hands disappeared beneath crisp cuffs before reappearing at his neck like ink refusing to obey expensive fabric. His expression softened the moment our eyes met. "You made it." I almost turned around twice. I expected 3 times. A faint smile escaped me. "You're very encouraging. You're still here." Before I could answer, another voice floated through the hall. "Vincent." His mother descended the curved staircase with graceful confidence, dressed in cream silk that somehow looked effortless. She studied me before offering her hand, not coldly, simply, carefully. Like someone examining an unfamiliar object. "Emma." "Mrs. Moretti. Thank you for inviting me." Her eyes lingered on my uniform. "Vincent mentioned you work as a waitress." "Yes, ma'am." "Hard work." "It is." "Education wasn't the path you chose?" The question landed gently enough that anyone else might have mistaken it for conversation. I recognized something different beneath it. Curiosity mixed with assumption. "Life doesn't always move in straight lines," I answered. She smiled politely without really smiling. "Of course." Vincent glanced toward me for barely a second. He had heard it too. Yet he remained silent. The dining room overlooked acres of manicured gardens where evening light spilled across fountains like liquid gold. Crystal glasses caught every reflection. Place cards rested beside porcelain so delicate I hesitated before touching anything. As another member of the staff handed everyone leather-bound dinner menus, Mrs. Moretti reached across the table before mine could be placed in front of me. "Oh," she said pleasantly. "Someone bring Emma the simplified menu instead." The room became so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "Mother," Vincent said quietly. She looked genuinely puzzled. "What?" I only assumed. Her gaze settled on me with perfect confidence. That reading French culinary terms might be unnecessarily uncomfortable. No one moved. No one corrected her. Every eye found me. I looked at Vincent for the briefest moment. His jaw tightened almost invisibly, but he still said nothing. Then I turned back to his mother and smiled with complete sincerity. "Actually," I said softly, "the chef's pronunciation on the English menu is usually less accurate than the original French. I'd love the standard one if that's all right." For the first time since I'd entered the mansion, Mrs. Moretti stopped looking at my uniform and started looking directly into my eyes. Mrs. Moretti held my gaze for another quiet second before sliding the original menu across the polished table without another word. It was not an apology. It was not acceptance either. It felt more like the opening move in a game neither of us had agreed to play. The candles reflected against crystal glasses while servers moved through the room with perfect timing, placing each course in front of us as though silence itself had become another guest at the table. I thanked every person who served us by name whenever I heard one introduced. Small habits stay with you when you spend years working in restaurants. People remember the guests who notice them. Mrs. Moretti noticed that too. "You seem familiar with formal service," she observed while carefully unfolding her linen napkin. "You learn quickly when you spend enough evenings carrying trays instead of sitting behind them," I answered. She smiled politely. "Experience is valuable. Refinement usually requires something more." Vincent quietly placed his fork on the table. "Mother." She looked toward him. "Are we no longer allowed to have conversations?" "We are." "Then let us continue." She turned back to me with perfect composure. "Tell me, Emma, what do you enjoy reading?" It was another elegant test wrapped inside harmless conversation. History, biographies, and occasionally poetry when life becomes too loud. Her eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. "Poetry? It slows the world down." "Favorite poet?" "Mary Oliver." The answer came naturally because it was true. I could still remember reading her words during exhausting double shifts, finding unexpected peace between coffee breaks and closing duties. Mrs. Moretti stirred her tea once before asking another question. "Not Shakespeare?" "I enjoy Shakespeare. Mary Oliver simply reminds me to notice ordinary moments before they disappear." Across the table Vincent remained completely still. His green eyes moved between us, watching every sentence like someone following invisible currents beneath calm water. Another course arrived. A middle-aged gentleman entered the dining room carrying several leather folders before quietly approaching Mrs. Moretti. "I apologize for the interruption. The trustees requested your review before tomorrow morning." She accepted the documents with obvious annoyance. "They could not wait one evening?" "Apparently not." She opened the folder, scanning several pages before exhaling softly. Legal language written by people who enjoy making simple ideas impossible. Almost unconsciously, I noticed one page had been placed upside down beneath another. A paragraph caught my attention through the transparent sheet protector. "Excuse me," I said carefully. "I think page 14 references the Charitable Education Trust, but the amendment attached belongs to the property agreement." Everyone looked at me. The gentleman blinked. "That cannot be correct." Mrs. Moretti examined both pages before slowly separating them. Her expression changed. "William." "Yes, ma'am?" "She is right." He quickly reorganized the documents, his face turning bright red. "I do not understand how. You mixed tomorrow's contracts." His voice almost disappeared. "I sincerely apologize." Mrs. Moretti closed the folder without taking her eyes off me. "You recognize that from a brief glance? The scholarship clause uses different terminology than real estate documents." The wording stood out. She rested one hand on the folder. "How would a waitress know that?" I smiled gently. "Because every Thursday afternoon I volunteer at a neighborhood legal literacy center, helping adults fill out paperwork they are too embarrassed to admit they do not understand. Reading complicated documents is usually easier than convincing people they deserve patience." The dining room became impossibly still again. This time no one looked at my uniform. They looked at everything beyond it. No one rushed to fill the silence. The servers continued clearing plates with the same polished rhythm they had practiced for years, but something invisible had shifted beneath the surface of the evening. William quietly excused himself with the folders held tighter against his chest, while Mrs. Moretti watched the closed dining room door for a thoughtful moment before lifting her wineglass. "Community work," she finally said. "That is generous." "It is practical," I replied. Most people are not afraid of difficult words. They are afraid of looking foolish because they do not understand them. She slowly lowered the glass. "And you never feel that way?" "Every day." That answer seemed to surprise her more than anything else I had said. Confidence is not pretending to know everything. It is being willing to ask when you do not. Vincent looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. It was not admiration. It was recognition, as though he had just discovered another piece of someone he thought he already understood. Dinner continued with conversations about architecture, charitable foundations, and city development. I listened more than I spoke, only offering thoughts when someone addressed me directly. The strange thing was that people gradually started asking more questions. Not because I demanded attention, but because listening carefully often made people curious in return. A retired judge seated near the end of the table mentioned a historic courthouse renovation downtown. I recognized the building immediately because I passed it every morning on my walk to the diner where I worked. We spoke briefly about preserving old neighborhoods instead of replacing every brick with another tower of glass. Even Mrs. Moretti contributed without the sharp undertone that had colored her earlier questions. Yet one person remained unusually quiet. Vincent answered only when spoken to. His responses were measured, respectful, almost distant. Anyone meeting him for the first time would have assumed he was simply reserved. I knew better. Every few minutes I caught him watching his mother when she looked away, then looking at me before quickly lowering his eyes to his plate. The silence belonged to him now. After dessert, Mrs. Moretti suggested coffee in the library. The room felt warmer than the formal dining hall, lined from floor to ceiling with dark walnut shelves filled with thousands of books collected across decades. A fire crackled softly despite the cool spring evening. Family photographs rested beside first editions and framed awards that reflected generations of accomplishment. I wandered toward one shelf while everyone settled into conversation behind me. My fingertips stopped near an old volume whose spine had begun to fade. You know that collection? Mrs. Moretti asked from across the room. My father used to borrow this edition from our public library, I answered with a smile. He could never afford to buy it, but every summer he checked it out before anyone else. She walked closer. He enjoyed classics? He enjoyed learning. Money and curiosity rarely arrived together at the same time. She studied my face with a different expression now, searching rather than judging. Before either of us could say another word, one of the household staff hurried into the library carrying a cordless phone. Mrs. Moretti, I apologize for interrupting, but the chairman of the Moretti Foundation is on the line. Tomorrow morning's scholarship interview panel has a problem. One of the final candidates has unexpectedly withdrawn, and they need a replacement recommendation tonight. Mrs. Moretti accepted the phone, then looked slowly around the room before her eyes settled on me once again, as though an unexpected possibility had quietly entered her mind without asking permission. Mrs. Moretti excused herself to take the call near the tall windows overlooking the gardens, her voice calm but noticeably firmer than before. No one in the library pretended not to listen. Conversations faded into whispers while the fire continued its quiet rhythm behind us. I wandered toward a framed photograph of Vincent as a teenager standing beside his father, both wearing the same composed expression that seemed almost inherited. He hated pictures, Vincent said as he joined me. You can tell. I smiled at the photograph. He looks like someone negotiating with the camera. A quiet laugh escaped him before disappearing almost as quickly. You have managed something very few people accomplish. What is that? You made my mother curious. I am not sure that is a victory. Neither am I. His honesty settled between us more comfortably than reassurance would have. I turned toward him. You knew she assumed I could not read before we even sat down. He did not deny it. Yes. You also knew she kept testing me. Yes. I waited. He remained silent long enough that the answer became obvious. And you chose not to stop it. His eyes lowered briefly before meeting mine again. I believed you did not need rescuing. That is different from standing beside someone. The words came quietly, without accusation, yet I watched something shift across his face. Vincent was a man accustomed to solving problems before anyone else noticed them. Tonight he had solved nothing. Before either of us could continue, Mrs. Moretti returned carrying the cordless phone with a thoughtful expression. I have an unusual request. Everyone turned toward her. The foundation lost one member of tomorrow morning's scholarship interview panel because of a medical emergency. We now have an empty seat. One of the trustees looked surprised. Finding a qualified replacement tonight will be difficult. Mrs. Moretti slowly nodded before looking directly at me. Perhaps not. The room grew still again. Emma, she continued, you volunteer helping adults understand legal documents. You have first-hand experience with educational barriers that many of us only discuss in conference rooms. Would you consider joining tomorrow's interview panel as a community representative? I blinked, convinced I had misunderstood her. Me? Yes. A distinguished gentleman sitting near the fireplace cleared his throat. With respect, Catherine, our panel usually consists of university presidents, judges, and foundation directors. His words remained polite, but their meaning did not. Another guest added carefully, the scholarship receives thousands of applications every year. Mrs. Moretti did not answer them immediately. She continued watching me instead. I have not accepted, I reminded everyone softly. Vincent finally spoke after remaining quiet for most of the evening. If my mother is asking, she has already decided she believes Emma would contribute something valuable. Every head turned toward him. It was the first time he had openly supported me all night, and the timing was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Moretti looked briefly at her son before returning her attention to me. Would you be willing to think about it? I took a slow breath. The invitation itself was unexpected. The room watching my answer made it feel even heavier. May I ask one question first? Of course. Do you want someone who represents people with impressive resumes? I asked gently, or someone who remembers exactly how intimidating opportunity feels when you have almost convinced yourself it belongs to someone else? No one answered immediately. The fire crackled softly behind us while even the trustees seemed unable to look away. For the first time that evening, the question hanging in the library was no longer whether I belonged inside the mansion. It was whether the people who had built the mansion truly understood the purpose of the doors they kept opening. The library remained wrapped in thoughtful silence until Mrs. Moretti gave the smallest nod. That, she said quietly, is exactly why I asked. One of the trustees leaned forward in his chair, clearly unconvinced. Catherine, with respect, scholarships of this size cannot become emotional exercises. We evaluate measurable achievement. Achievement without perspective becomes arrogance, Mrs. Moretti replied. Her answer surprised everyone, including me. The gentleman folded his hands. Perspective is valuable. Qualifications are essential. I finally spoke. He is right. Several heads turned toward me. I have never served on a scholarship panel. There are people far more experienced than I am. Vincent looked at me with quiet confusion, almost expecting me to accept immediately. Instead, I continued. If your foundation needs someone to replace decades of academic experience, I am not the right person. Mrs. Moretti watched me carefully. And if we need someone who understands what opportunity feels like before it arrives? I smiled gently. Then I would be honored to help, but only if everyone in this room believes I belong there for the same reason. The words settled heavily over the library. One trustee looked away. Another slowly removed his glasses, avoiding my eyes. The disagreement was no longer about qualifications. It had become something much harder to admit. Vincent stepped closer, his posture calm but unmistakably protective. Emma does not need anyone to lower standards for her. His voice remained even. If she joins the panel, she should be judged by the same expectations as everyone else. I looked toward him, grateful for the sentiment, yet something inside me tightened. Where had that voice been an hour earlier? Where had those words been when the first assumption had been made at the dinner table? Gratitude and disappointment can exist in the same heart at exactly the same time. Mrs. Moretti noticed the brief exchange between us before anyone else did. Her eyes lingered on Vincent for only a moment. "Tomorrow's interviews begin at 9 o'clock, she said. "There is no obligation." I took a slow breath. "Then I will respectfully decline." The room froze. Vincent turned toward me immediately. "Emma." I shook my head softly. "Not because I am offended. Not because I doubt myself." I looked directly at Mrs. Moretti. "Because tonight has been about proving that I deserve to sit at someone else's table. Tomorrow should be about students proving they deserve a chance, not about people wondering whether I earned my chair." No one interrupted. Even the fire seemed quieter. Mrs. Moretti lowered her eyes for the first time that evening. "You believe my invitation came too late." "I believe it came sincerely," I answered. "But sincerity does not erase first impressions. Trust grows more slowly than respect." Vincent's expression changed. The realization reached him all at once. His silence during dinner had not protected my dignity. It had asked me to carry the entire weight of it alone. He stepped toward me as though to explain, but I gently raised one hand. "Please do not fix this because it became uncomfortable. I needed you when it was easy to misunderstand me." The words were calm, almost tender, which somehow made them heavier. Vincent stopped where he was. For the first time since I had met him, the certainty that usually surrounded him disappeared completely. Mrs. Moretti looked from her son back to me, and the confidence she had carried all evening gave way to something far more difficult to hide. It was not embarrassment. It was regret. Vincent did not move for several long seconds. The library that had felt so welcoming only minutes earlier suddenly seemed much larger, as though the distance between people could expand without anyone taking a single step. He finally looked at his mother instead of me. "She is right." His voice remained steady, but something inside it had changed. I saw every assumption. I heard every question. I convinced myself that staying quiet meant respecting both of you. Mrs. Moretti folded her hands slowly. "Vincent." "No." He spoke gently, never raising his voice. "This time, please let me finish." Even the trustees remained silent. I have spent my entire life believing that control meant waiting until the perfect moment to speak. Tonight I learned that silence can become agreement if it lasts too long. His words settled over the room with surprising weight. He turned back toward me. "I thought giving you space to answer for yourself showed confidence in you." I met his eyes without anger. It showed confidence in my strength. It did not show that you were standing beside me. He closed his eyes briefly, absorbing every word instead of defending himself. That alone made the room feel different. Most people explain before they understand. Vincent was trying to understand first. Mrs. Moretti quietly walked toward the fireplace. The warm light reflected across family photographs arranged on the mantel. She picked up one frame showing Vincent as a young boy sitting beside his father with a stack of books balanced on his knees. His father believed education was the only inheritance that could never be stolen, she said softly. He built this foundation because he remembered growing up with nothing. She looked down at the photograph for another moment before continuing. Somewhere along the way, I became more concerned with protecting standards than remembering why those standards existed. No one interrupted her. "When I saw your uniform tonight," she admitted while looking directly at me, "I filled in the rest of your story without asking you to tell it yourself. That failure belongs entirely to me." The words carried no performance, no attempt to erase the evening. They simply existed. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." She gave a faint, saddened smile. "I expected you to correct me immediately. People rarely believe corrections offered in self-defense. And yet you answered every question. Because I wanted you to know me, not defeat you." Her eyes shimmered with quiet emotion she never allowed to become dramatic. One trustee stood and approached the window overlooking the gardens. "Perhaps we have all been evaluating resumes for too many years," he said thoughtfully. "We have forgotten that character does not arrive inside expensive folders." Another trustee quietly agreed. "Some of our strongest scholarship recipients came from circumstances none of us would have predicted." Vincent remained where he was, but the confidence that usually surrounded him had become something humbler. "Emma," he said, "I cannot change what happened tonight." "No. But I can choose differently the next time." I studied his face for a long moment. There was no certainty left there, only honesty. Oddly enough, honesty was harder to refuse. Before I could answer, Mrs. Moretti walked to a small writing desk near the library entrance and opened a drawer. She removed a worn leather notebook with faded edges and placed it carefully into my hands. "This belonged to Vincent's father," she said quietly. "He carried it through law school while working nights to pay tuition. Inside are names of every person who helped him before anyone believed he would succeed. I have never shown it to a guest." My fingers rested lightly on the weathered cover as I realized this was not a gift. It was trust offered for the first time, and somehow it felt even heavier than an apology. The old notebook felt surprisingly heavy for something made of paper and worn leather. I traced the faded initials embossed on the cover before carefully opening the first page. The handwriting was neat, steady, and completely ordinary. There were no famous quotations, no grand speeches, only names followed by short notes. "Mrs. Alvarez. Paid for my first textbooks. Coach Miller. Stayed after practice so I could finish homework. Unknown man at the bus station. Bought me dinner when I had $1 left." I looked up at Mrs. Moretti. He remembered everyone. Her voice softened. He believed gratitude should be recorded before success erased the memory of needing help. I turned another page. Every line reflected the same quiet discipline. Every person mattered. Wealth had not built this family first. Kindness had. Somehow that truth had become hidden beneath years of reputation and expectations. One of the trustees stepped closer. "I have attended foundation meetings for almost 15 years, he admitted. "I never knew this notebook existed." Mrs. Moretti smiled sadly. Neither did Vincent. Vincent looked genuinely surprised. "You never showed it to me." "Because I thought you already understood your father." She paused before adding, "Tonight I realized I had stopped understanding him myself." The confession lingered in the room. It did not erase the evening, but it changed its direction. I carefully closed the notebook and offered it back to her. She gently pushed it toward me again. "Please keep it until tomorrow." I hesitated. "I cannot accept something so personal." "You are not accepting ownership." She smiled with quiet sincerity. "You are carrying a reminder. Bring it back after the scholarship interviews, whether you decide to participate or not." I looked toward Vincent. He was no longer standing behind his family's expectations. He had stepped away from them without leaving his family behind. There was a difference I had not recognized before. He walked closer, stopping beside me instead of across from me. "Emma, I cannot ask you to forgive me tonight." "You should not." He nodded once. "Then allow me to earn another conversation." The simplicity of the request caught me off guard. There was no promise to fix everything overnight, no dramatic declaration, only a willingness to accept that trust returned one decision at a time. I appreciated that more than perfect words. "Conversations are easier when both people are speaking," I answered. A faint smile appeared across his face. "I finally understand that." Mrs. Moretti quietly crossed the library and rang a small brass bell resting on a side table. A member of the household staff entered almost immediately. "Please contact the foundation office," she said. "Inform them tomorrow's interviews will begin 30 minutes later than scheduled." One trustee looked puzzled. "May I ask why?" she answered without hesitation. Because before we evaluate students, this board needs 30 minutes to discuss why we choose them in the first place. No one argued. No one questioned the decision. Something fundamental had shifted. As we walked together toward the front entrance, I glanced through the tall windows. The gardens outside looked exactly as they had when I arrived, perfectly trimmed beneath the evening lights. Yet the mansion no longer felt like a place built to keep people out. It felt like a place quietly learning that the strongest doors were never the ones made of iron. They were the ones people finally chose to open inside themselves. The drive back into the city felt strangely quiet. Vincent kept both hands on the steering wheel while the lights of the Hudson slipped across the windshield like reflections searching for somewhere to settle. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence because some conversations needed room before they could become honest. When we reached my apartment building, he parked along the curb and turned off the engine without unlocking the doors immediately. "You still have my father's notebook," he said softly. I rested my hand on the worn leather cover lying across my lap. "I know. You can keep it until tomorrow." I looked out at the familiar brick buildings surrounding my neighborhood. Children were chasing one another beneath streetlights while a delivery driver waved to an elderly woman carrying groceries. Nothing about the block looked impressive. Everything about it felt real. "Do you know what surprised me most tonight?" I asked. Vincent shook his head. "Your mother never asked where I learned the things that impressed everyone. She only realized she had never asked who I was." He nodded slowly. "She spent years believing answers came before questions. A lot of people do." He smiled faintly. "I inherited some of that." "You inherited her confidence." I turned toward him. "You do not have to inherit every mistake." His expression softened, but there was still sadness behind his eyes. "I have been thinking about what you said in the library." "Which part?" "That standing back is not the same as standing beside someone." He took a slow breath. "I have built my life solving problems after they appear. I never realized that sometimes the real responsibility is preventing someone from carrying them alone." I reached for the notebook and handed it to him. "Open the last page." He looked confused but did exactly that. A folded piece of paper slipped onto the center console. Mrs. Moretti's handwriting covered only a few short lines. Vincent read silently before looking at me with unmistakable surprise. "She wrote this tonight." She tucked it inside while everyone was leaving. His voice grew quieter as he read the note again. "If you are reading this, then Emma trusted you enough to return what I trusted her with. Do not mistake forgiveness for forgetting. Earn both with patience." He carefully folded the paper exactly as he had found it. "That sounds like my mother. It also sounds like someone trying to become a better version of herself." We sat together for another minute before my phone vibrated. A message from an unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. It was from the executive director of the foundation. Mrs. Moretti had already informed them that I would not be serving on the interview panel. Instead, she had requested something entirely different. Tomorrow afternoon, after the interviews concluded, she wanted me to speak privately with every scholarship recipient about resilience, dignity, and the invisible barriers that never appear on application forms. There would be no voting power, no official title, and no seat at the judge's table. There would simply be a room full of young people who needed someone willing to tell them that their story did not become smaller because another person misunderstood it. I looked over at Vincent. He had not seen the message yet, but somehow he already knew something had changed. For the first time that evening, neither of us felt the need to prove anything. The only thing left was deciding what we would build from everything we had finally learned. The following afternoon, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Moretti Foundation headquarters, warming polished oak floors that had welcomed generations of ambitious students. I arrived carrying nothing except my small notebook and the quiet certainty that I belonged there for reasons no title could measure. The scholarship interviews had already ended by the time I stepped into the reception hall. Groups of hopeful students stood beside anxious parents, some dressed in expensive suits, others wearing the only formal clothes they owned. Every face carried the same question. Would today change everything? The executive director greeted me with a grateful smile before leading me into a modest conference room instead of the grand boardroom upstairs. Mrs. Moretti insisted this conversation happen here, he explained. She said encouragement should never feel intimidating. A few minutes later, the first scholarship recipients entered. They did not ask about grades or awards. They asked how to keep believing in themselves after years of being underestimated. They asked how to walk into rooms where nobody expected them to succeed. I answered with stories instead of speeches. I told them that dignity grows quietly, that confidence does not arrive because strangers approve of you, and that the strongest education teaches you how to keep your kindness even after someone questions your worth. Their expressions slowly changed from uncertainty into hope. When the final student thanked me before leaving, I noticed someone standing silently outside the open doorway. Mrs. Moretti had been listening for longer than I realized. She walked inside after the room became empty, holding a small envelope in one hand. Those students will remember this afternoon much longer than they remember the scholarship ceremony, she said. That is because someone finally spoke to who they are instead of what they achieved. She handed me the envelope. Inside was the worn note Vincent had found in his father's notebook, now carefully framed beneath a new line written in her own handwriting. The family legacy is not preserved by wealth. It is preserved by the people we choose to honor. I looked up, unsure what to say. She smiled with a warmth that had not existed the night before. I spent years believing refinement meant recognizing excellence. Yesterday you reminded me it begins with recognizing humanity. Before I could respond, Vincent appeared at the end of the hallway. He was still wearing an elegant black suit, his familiar tattoos visible along his neck and hands, but there was something different in the way he stood. He no longer carried himself like a man protecting a reputation. He looked like someone protecting a promise. He walked toward us before stopping beside his mother instead of between us. Mrs. Moretti glanced at him, then at me, and quietly slipped her arm through her son's without saying a single word. It was a simple gesture, yet it acknowledged us both at the same time. No announcement followed. No dramatic apology echoed through the building. None was needed. As Vincent and I stepped outside into the bright afternoon, the city sounded exactly as it always had, but I understood something I had not known when I first crossed the gates of his family's home. Some people spend their lives trying to prove they deserve a seat at the table. Others discover that real respect begins the moment they stop asking for permission to be seen. That lesson did not change only one evening. It quietly changed an entire family, and long after the conversations faded, it remained the loudest thing anyone in that room would ever remember.